Okay. Hello and welcome to the National Flash Fiction Day Novella-in-Flash panel. As some of you may be aware, this year is the National Flash Fiction Day are celebrating 10 years of existence, and we have launched a Novella-in-Flash award this year. And to run alongside that, we thought it would be nice to put a panel together and authors who can talk about their experiences of writing Novella-in-Flash. Some have already been published, some are about to be published. So I'm going to hand over to Johanna Robinson. I'm delighted that Johanna said that she would host the evening for us, and I'm thrilled we've got the panel that we've got. So I'll just introduce Johanna before I hand over to her. Johanna Robinson is based near Liverpool, UK, and has been writing short fiction for around 5 years. Her work has been featured in various magazines and anthologies, including Smokelong, Reflex Press, and Mislexia. In 2020, she won the TSS Cambridge Prize for Flash Fiction and the Bath Flash Fiction Award. And in 2019, Ad Hoc Fiction published her Novella-in-Flash Homing, which follows a Norwegian resistance family in the Second World War. I'll be posting all the authors' links and Johanna's link and more about the Novella-in-Flash Award at the end of the evening on the chat bar. So without further ado, I hand over to you, Johanna, and I'm going to disappear.
Well, thanks, Jeanette. That's a great introduction. So I'm just going to have a bit of a chat about National Flash Fiction Day and novellas in Flash in general, and the brilliant authors that we've got with us today. That'll probably take about 10 minutes, and then we'll get round to having a chat with our writers. So I'd like to welcome everyone that's here. We've got 37 people, I think, in total, including us. So it's a real privilege to be able to chat to all our writers who are joining us today from Arizona, USA, Wales, Glasgow, London and Cornwall. And we have Karen Jones, Eleanor Walsh, Tom O'Brien, Dan Crawley and Jupiter Jones. And we'll be here for about an hour, but like Jeanette said, we might run over a little bit and the chat box will be open later for questions. So before we hear from our panellists about how they approach their writing their novellas in Flash, just have a bit of a chat about National Flash Fiction Day. So it was last month, 26th of June, and it's a real privilege to be able to be here a month later and carry on the celebrations. And as part of that, I want to say thank you to the team who help National Flash Fiction Day be what it is in June and ongoing, like today, and with the new Novella-in-Flash competition. Moving on to our writers, they've all had published at least one stunning novella-in-Flash, or in Tom's case, novelette-in-Flash as well, which is slightly shorter at 8,000 words. And I'm in awe of anyone who's written more than one, because I've only just started my second, and that was 2019 when mine came out. So to anyone who's written 2 or more, well done, it's brilliant. So they're all either out already or forthcoming with Ad Hoc or Reflex. But obviously for anyone who is looking to submit theirs or read more, we've also got other presses in the UK, like V Press, Fairlight Moderns, Ellipsis, Retreat West, and of course National Flash Fiction Day. So if we have a little chat about share my thoughts really on what a novella-in-Flash is. And despite every single one that I've ever read being utterly unique and in its story and its voice, or perhaps because of that, it's helpful to have some kind of definition in mind, I think. And Sophie Van Leeuwen, who wrote Bottled Goods, she summed it up really simply. She said, the challenge of a novella-in-Flash is a double challenge: to write small, successfully self-contained stories and to create a story arc. And Nancy Stallman, in her book Going Short, which Ad Hoc Fiction has published as well, she puts it slightly differently. She says, often within a traditional book-length narrative, there are many islands of story, plus a whole lot of connective tissue, getting us from one island to the next. Now imagine a book that's only the islands, only the best parts, the juicy parts full of colour and conflict. Or as Elmore Leonard said in his 10 Rules of Writing, try to leave out the part that readers tend to skip. So I think they're really useful definitions, very loose definitions to keep in mind, really. And this week I've read or reread the novellas from all the writers that we've got with us today. And again, I've been blown away by the scope and the quality of the writing of those. Some have a really specific place and time. We move from Nepal to 1970s America, to 1980s Scotland, Midlands, to the 1990s Cornwall, and to the Balkans War and the Falklands War, while other writers create a really astonishing sense of place, but without telling us exactly where it is. And what all the novellas by our panellists today have in common, like loads of Novella-in-Flash, of course, is a sense of play and freedom to do what other forms can't do, whereby the point of view can change from chapter to chapter, or the time period changes, or the location. They can be told over decades or days. And while reading this week, from my point of view, I started to see the stories, the individual stories in these books as leaps from place to place. So either along a road between towns like Dan's, or within the same city, zooming into different bits like Jupiter's book that's going to come out next year, or leaps that take us backwards. Again, Jupiter does this in her Mrs. Parker book, from memory to memory, or backwards and forwards using flashbacks, which Ellie and Tom do. Or the characters take a leap very gradually to get to know themselves better and better. And so the leap is the story, and the space in between is the space in between the chapters. And I think it's such a thrill to be able to read such different novellas that we've got coming out at the moment, by the writers we have here, but also by everybody who is writing them, and ad hoc fiction, who's publishing loads of them. And what sums it up for me is that the stories give us some flash fiction form in Novella-in-Flash, gives us something that is together and separate at the same time. And this aspect really reflects the lives of the people in the pages, a switching between like loneliness and community and a sense of friendship. And then of course that reflects not just the people in the pages, but all of us in our lives as well. And that's why I really love the Novella-in-Flash form, and are quite in awe of the writing that's going on in that genre at the moment. So I'm going to move on and read the bios of our writers, and then we'll have a little chat about their books. So Dan Crawley is the author of the novella Straight Down the Road and the short story collection The Wind It Swells. His writing appears in a number of journals and anthologies, including JMWW, Lost Balloon, the North American Review, Smokelong Quarterly, Wigleaf, Quarterly West, and Atticus Review. He's a recipient of an Arizona Commission on the Arts Creative Writing Fellowship, and two-time Best Small Fictions and Best of the Net nominee, Bushcart Prize nominee, and appears on the Wigleaf Top 50 long list. Straight Down the Road was highly commended in the Bath Novella-in-Flash Award 2019. Jupiter Jones grew up on the northwest coasts of Cumberland and Lancashire. The first was wild and secretive, the second trashy and jaded. She loved them both and they haunt her writing, which is true. Following a brief spell in London to complete a PhD in spectatorial embarrassment at Goldsmiths, she now lives in Wales and writes short and flash fictions. She's the winner of the Colm Toibin International Prize, and her work's been published by Aesthetica, Brittle Star, Fish and Scottish Arts. Her Novella-in-Flash, The Death and Life of Mrs. Parker, was shortlisted in the Bath 2021 competition and will be published by Ad Hoc later this year. Is it September the 11th, Jupiter?
10th.
10th, September the 10th.
I hope so.
That's very soon. And Lovelace Flats was runner-up in the Reflex Press novella competition and will be published in 2022. And there won't be many people who here who have read that, but I have, and it's fab. So put that in your diary for next year. Karen Jones is a flash and short story writer from Glasgow, Scotland. She's a perennial long and short lister. She's doing herself down here. She's also won stuff. She's won prizes with Dyslexia, Flash 500, Words with Jam, Ink Tears, Ad Hoc, Retreat West, and she won first prize this year in the Cambridge Flash Fiction Prize. Her work's been published in numerous e-zines, magazines, and anthologies. Her story, Small Mercies, was nominated for Best Small Fictions, Best of the Net, a Pushcart Prize, and is included in Best Small Fictions 2019. Her Novella-in-Flash, When It's Not Called Making Love, is published by Ad Hoc. Tom O'Brien is an Irishman living in London. His Novella-in-Flash, Straw Gods, is published by Reflex Press, and his Novelette-in-Flash, Homemade Weather, with Retreat West. His work's been Pushcart and Best Microfictions nominated, and he's the winner of the 2021 National Flash Fiction Day New Zealand Best Microfiction. His flash fiction and short stories can be found in print in various anthologies, such as Blink Ink and Bath Flash Fiction, as well as sites around the web, including Ellipsis, Reflex, Spelk, and 50-Word Stories. And last but not least, Eleanor Walsh is a PhD graduate from the University of Plymouth. She lives in Cornwall, where she works as an English tutor and creative editor. Her novella, Birds with Horse Hearts, set in Nepal, won the Bath Novella-in-Flash Award in 2019. And Stormbred, set in Cornwall, was a highly commended entry in 2020, and each is published by Ad Hoc. So now we know all about our authors. I'm going to ask the same questions to each of you in turn at first. So, and I've got some more on my sleeve if we've got time. So, first, I want you to tell us a bit about your Novella-in-Flash. If you've got more than one, choose your favourite. If you've got it with you, hold it up. Jupiter, we can't do that with you, but so tell us a bit about how you came to write it and the story of it. So if we start with Dan.
Okay. Yay, straight down the road. And Janice Laguerra did the cover. She did an amazing job. It's like a work of art. So get this so you can like put it up on your wall too and have one of her originals. So around 2017, I published a flash fiction called Protective Services. And then in 2018, I read Sophie's book, Auto Goods. And when I read it, I was so blown away about what, Johanna was talking about, the self-contained stories within each chapter, and then the empty space in between, how you would make these leaps from chapter to chapter, and in your mind, work on the imagination of what is actually going on with these characters. So I got another story written called Lovey-Dovey that I thought, okay, these are the same characters, and they just really interest me. And so basically it's this family in the 1970s that are off on a vacation, and the dad does something really stupid, which causes the whole rest of the novella, and in the second story, the conflict to develop through the rest of the novella. And basically they become wanderers, and this becomes an elongated, vacation where all of this stuff is happening, and stuff is brewing between the parents, and the kids are dealing with what they're dealing with. And so, yeah, it's just probably, and if you put it in one sentence, the vacation gone awry, and it's just, and then all the craziness that ensues all the way up to the very last flash. So.
Yeah, that's a really, that really does sum it up. Karen, should we go to you?
Sure. Another Janice cover. So mine is When It's Not Called Making Love. I didn't intend to write this novella. I was working on an entirely different one for the Bath Flash Fiction Award, and I was I'd got halfway through it. I thought, I'm never going to get this done in time. There's only about 10 days to go. I'll just give up. And then I started noticing links between a few other stories I'd written. Only one of them was about the girl who ends up being the title character in the novella, Bernadette. But I realised that a few other stories I already had could be Bernadette's story, because they were all along the same theme. They were about a young girl sort of navigating childhood and adolescence, and about discovering sexuality, discovering good friendships and really bad friendships, but allowing herself to be treated badly by other people. And it's just about Bernadette basically finding her way. So it is a coming of age story, essentially. But see, when I realised that I had these links, then I thought, oh my God, okay, I've got 10 days. can I do this? Can I write all these other stories? So it actually was incredibly simple, because Bernadette, a lot of Bernadette is me in a way, you know, so they're not CNF stories, I don't mean that, but because she's of my class, of my area where I live, because I grew up in a village and she's in a village and whatever, it actually became quite simple to start putting it together like a jigsaw, which I kind of feel most Novellas-in-Flash probably are. I think we do kind of jigsaw a bit. Some of us don't follow a strict timeline, we mess around, whatever. I ended up going linear. At one point it wasn't. But yeah, it ended up a wee bit rushed, but I don't regret that, because it's got a kind of raw edge to it. And I think this story needs to be raw. I think if I'd had more time to perfect it, I might have ruined it completely.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So I've been reading them all this week, and each novella has a really different pace to it. And yours, you do rattle through it, like as a reader, because it takes you in the voice. I think I'm sure anybody who's read it and has heard you read as well from it reads it with your voice. Honestly, even chapters that I'd not heard you read, you were there in my head. So I love Bernadette. I think she's brilliant. Okay, Jupiter.
I'm going to talk about The Death and Life of Mrs. Parker, which is going to be published in September. I'd love to show you the book. I'd love to hold it up, but I'm sworn to secrecy, so can't. That started off as a short story. She was a very, very minor character in another short story that didn't really work. And she was so irritating. Her voice was there in my head, and she had so much backstory, all these anecdotes. So yeah, I started from there with her little memories. And then I came across, I was reading a bit about Martin Heidegger, the philosopher, and he said that time is not something we really experience as a continuum, but as a series of nows, a series of flashes, of instant moments. And there's a possibility that at times of stress, we might experience more than one of them at once. So she's certainly under stress, Mrs. Parker. She's gone out for a meal and she's having a heart attack and she's having CPR performed. And she's experiencing all these little flashes of nowness of her past life. She's been married 4 times. She says twice for love and twice for money. And she's looking back over those, and yeah, just playing holy hell with chronology. It can just pop up whenever. Yeah,
but you've done it so skillfully. Again, I know people won't have read this one, but to bring those nows into those memories into the now, and almost they just run parallel, don't they, to each other? They come really close to each other, and it could have gone so wrong, and you've got it so right.
Yeah, she gets very muddled up between one of the paramedics and her first husband. They were both called Frank, and yeah, it links.
Yeah, but again, she's in delirium, and Ellie does this as well in Stormbred, uses the hallucinations that seem really real to the reader, as real to the reader as they do to the characters, which again is a real skill. Tom, should we go to you?
Okay. I'll talk about Straw Gods, my first baby with reflex press. Oh, and I did the cover for this one, which was a real treat, being sort of allowed loose on Photoshop. So that was really nice. How it started, I'm pretty sure it would have started with me trying to avoid writing something else. Almost everything I write, that's how I write them. Both novellas, that's how they happened. Is I'm so sick of this, write something else, it'll be great. It's much easier than the thing you're writing, and then eventually that becomes the thing you run away from, and so on. But the more specific start of this one, I had this image. I had 2 things. I wanted to write something longer because I was writing Flash, which was great and fine, but it's 1,000 words and that's your lot. And mine was much shorter than that anyway. So I wanted to just push and just write a proper long short story. So I started with this image of flames, something straw stuck to a door. It made no sense whatsoever, but there were just some pictures on an island in a storm, and just pushed that and characters wandered in and out. And I had, as it evolved, I had this idea that the main character would be Saul, who's one of the characters in the book. And then he met people in this little village, a seaside village. And one of them was Rosa, and she just muscled in all the time. Her story just became more and more interesting as I wrote every little bit, as I wrote about storms and going to sea and so on. She had this real pain that kind of kept drawing me back to see, well, but what's going on with her? And as the final version of the book, she is the main character. Saul is still there, and he has a fairly significant story, but it's Rosa's story. And the more I found out about her, the more I found ways of linking that with the other characters in the village and their history. And I generally write things with very few characters, which is why Flash works so well. But this was a way of allowing me to build up something. It's still a small cast, but something more than I would normally do, simply by using her as the center. And then who did she interact with? Her sister was important to her. This child was important. And there's a twist in the story, which I had no idea about until the third draft. That thing was just, wow, what happened there? So it was one of those things that all the way along, it was, what's happening? I didn't know at all what was happening, more so than usual. This was really because I kind of wasn't doing something, I didn't have a plan. It was really enjoyable to just sort of, this thing isn't going to be anything. So there aren't any rules. And around the same time, as it was evolving into these little separate stories or scenes, I read Stephanie Hutton's Three Sisters of Stone, and that was a big old permission slip to sort of, they can actually stand apart. And because the bit that I struggled with on various efforts at short stories and novellas and novels is all of the connective tissue that Nancy Stallman talks about. That drives me nuts, because I get completely bogged down in it. Just walking someone down a road can get me completely stuck for ages. I get tangled up in timelines and all stuff like that. So this, you should just skip, never mind, up to the door, how they got there, that's their problem. And then I can start the scene again. And then afterwards I can worry about, but I've put them in two places at once. And that was all part of the learning with Straw Gods. And it's also the book that I learned properly, I guess, about editing, that before I would sort of, editing was glorified proofreading previously, whereas for this one, it was, no, stories are going to have to go, you know, that you won't be able to fix them. They're not right, they have to go. And then getting further into it, that how do I make a shape and a rhythm? Saul's stories are all much longer. They're closer to 1,000 words, and that's his keynote. And then all of the rest are very close to being micros, I would say. And again, that was something that I more noticed than decided, but when I noticed it, it became a useful thing to do. So it was an enjoyable process, and I'm very pleased and proud of the book that came out, but I'm actually really pleased with the process that sort of it became its own. It taught me how to write it, which sounds terribly pretentious when I say it, but that's really what happened. I had to work it out as I went along. How do I write this thing? What will it be? And then it turned into this thing. And again, I think similar to Karen, there were competition deadlines looming, and it was sort of, okay, enough faffing about, now finish this for a date. And that, you know, that last week or two, and it was exactly the same with Homemade Weather. For Retreat West, it was a run for the line, and for exactly the same for Ad Hoc's One for the River that's coming out later, rushed, sent in at the last minute. That's just how it works, because I could keep tinkering with it forever. So that much is there. But as far as Straw Gods, that was the one where all the Flash, the Novella-in-Flash idea coalesced. The reflex were good enough to print it.
It's something to throw out whole chapters, isn't it? From your storyline, quite something to throw out whole chapters and almost disrupt the story that you've been writing
quite a bit. Yeah. It really is, and that's something like, as Flash, you can make them work as independent pieces. You can say, well, this doesn't have to connect to anything, but when it has to be part of an arc of some sort, it's sort of, I can shoehorn it, I can change the perspective, I can do all of the tricks that we try, and so it's just not the right. It's not meant to be there. And I mean, I read elsewhere, and I took the advice that don't say that you're getting rid of it. Just, I'm putting that aside for now.
Yeah,
And it burns a little less, and you know in your heart you're never going to see that bloody thing again. But it's just, it'll do. It's enough to get it off the page, and then you're going, oh, now everything's moving forward again. I wonder what the problem was. It's because you had this thing clogging it that you love so
you're
much.
Just putting them to sleep.
Just getting the
of, yeah.
That's it. It's yes, they go to a nice farm up the country, and everything will always be fine. Exactly.
Put them in a coma
exactly
for a while.
No, that's it exactly. Yeah. So that's me.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting.
Cheers.
And Ellie, so you've got Stormbred and Birds with Horse Hearts. So how did you come across the form, and tell us a bit about whichever one you want to tell us about?
I'll talk about Birds with Horse Hearts because embarrassingly it's actually the only one that I own a copy of. I don't know why I don't have the other one. So I did my PhD fieldwork in Nepal, and it ended up dragging on for years. I don't know if anyone remembers the sort of natural disasters that were happening in 2015. There were major earthquakes, extensive flooding. India closed the border to Nepal, which led to an instant gas shortage. So my fieldwork went on for a really long time, and I was spending a lot of time doing very little towards my fieldwork and just doing agriculture in this very remote place in Nepal, just with Nepali women who led extremely difficult lives with which nobody had any familiarity, either in person or in literature, not only outside of Nepal, but actually even in Nepal. You know, it was a remote place. And so I had all of these scraps of writing that were all fiction. It is all fiction, but it was writing that I wrote while I was in Nepal, sort of reflecting on the lives that these women led. And so within a very short space of time, seeing the deadline for the birth competition worked that up into a narrative, kind of condensing all of that writing into two different characters. So that's one of them is the girl who sort of lives on the peripheries of society and has evaded lots of the expectations of women. And then the other woman, Kusbu, who has sort of, you know, been put through lots of the things that women are put through, like child marriage and reproductive coercion. And I'm making it sound really sad. I don't think it is all sad, but that was its genesis anyway.
I think it feels like, you know, I was saying with Karen's, you gallop through it, and it's one thing after another, and yours is the lyricism of it. It slows you down, and you do feel like you're there. You really, you know, for somewhere that, like you say, none of us know about at all. You do make it really, really familiar, as if the reader is standing at the edge watching, really. And the same with Stormbred, I would say, as well. So that's a really brilliant introduction from everybody. Thank you. I wonder, when I was talking about the Novella-in-Flash definition before, and Sophie van Leeuwen's was talking about the challenge of writing Novella-in-Flash. So perhaps we could go around and just talk about what you not found easy, but enjoyed about the process, and what in particular you found challenging. Jupiter, could we start with you?
Yeah, I think the bit that I like most is that you get a lot of beginnings and a lot of endings, and they are both so rewarding to write. So yeah, love that. And the bit that I think is hardest is what you've talked about as being connective tissue. Let's put another word to it. Let's call it gristle. And that is the hardest bit. I read other novellas in Flash where they only just hang together, and they are so beautiful, and I can't do it. I find that mine are thick with gristle. Too much story, not enough flash, and too much arc. But that's the way I write.
I'm in the same camp. Yeah. No, I would. So
there we go.
I'd be that side. Yeah.
That's the best and the worst for me.
Well, I mean, if you say there's too much gristle, I think you know, they're just great, and yeah, everybody's is very, very different. But you make yours sound like you're wading through them. You're not. You're really not. It's very light touch and funny as well. like really funny. Tom, do you want to answer as well? You had the same kind of.
Well, I was just sorry, I was diving in there, but yeah,
No, go
I
ahead.
find myself in that. I find myself in that sort of boat as well. That I get very married to story. I feel very unsafe without, and every time I start something, it's sort of right. This is going to be something a little bit looser. There's going to just be held together by a theme or an idea, and it's sort of crash cut to 6 months later. It's kind of right. Well, he needs to go in this door so he can meet her. I've just had to accept that now. I'm not going to be. I read, I think, Michelle Elvey's Ever Rumble, and that thing just floats around, and I think this is amazing. And I want to write like this. I want something that's just all about pictures and images and feelings, and it's just not. It's not me. It's in the end. I need some sort of spine, even if it doesn't have to be made apparent for the reader. I need it. I need to sort of know that everything lines up and that it's mechanically good enough and psychologically good enough and solid, rather than a beautiful image that I just can't give weight to. So that's both a kind of, it's a frustration and a pleasure in a way, because having done a few of them now, the lesson I certainly learned is that each one is different and it will demand to be written a certain way. I spoke about how Straw Gods started was one sort of try to write something longer, and then having done that, I thought, well, I've cracked this now. I know how to do this. So I went to write Homemade Weather for Retreat West and for the Novella, and it just wasn't having any of that sort of carry on. That started as a short story that wasn't working. So we have an echo there as well. But I just looked at that story and thought of I'd read about the idea of sort of breaking something open and maybe expanding it that way. And I thought I'd try that with a story that wasn't standing on its own right. And then what started happening was, with the character Celia in that one, I said, well, I should really know a little bit more of her backstory just to fill it out. And the backstory started becoming the book. So I went further and further back to just for my research, but they came out as stories in a few, or at least with the bones of stories in a few cases. So I thought, okay, let's keep going back. And I ended up telling something like her life story, rather than the pretension in the book is it's a tiny little 8,000 word book, but I split it into 3 books as if I'm Tolstoy or something. But it's this tiny thing. But that allowed me to say, okay, just talk about her now as a child, talk about her now as a teenager, talk about her now as an adult. And again, that was just me getting hung up on Gristle in that respect, because that's okay, that's what I need. Let's just live with that. But it opened up so many things then that I gave myself, if you like, permission to just don't worry about book 2, don't worry about book 3, just get book 1, and the story ends up, the original short story, the most similar thing to that is book 3. So the other 2, I know the rule is arrive late and get out early, but for some reason I arrived way too late for my own story and had to go back and back and back and make it 2 other stories that when combined made her full story. And then then I had a coherent thing that bore some resemblance to the original short story, not a massive amount, but the sinews, the bones of it were there. But that's not the book. That's just how the book ends. It was the rest of the book, like
splitting it into smaller pieces to put it back together again.
It must be a Flash
amputation
at this stage. Just make them small. So honestly, I've got some manuscripts that are broken down. It seems like into sentences. They're just absolutely tiny, because I don't know which one of those is going to sort of spring out and become a larger little story. It certainly happened in Straw Gods that this idea that she has these stones that she keeps in water, and I kind of just had the image of a bowl with pebbles or stones in them, and I wasn't really sure what that was all about, but it ended up actually being that was her grief, and she was using the water to keep the stones cool, because it was too hot for her to deal with, and that just came by revisiting and breaking down this thing about the bowl and the stones and this image, and sort of standing her in front of him saying, what's that about? And that allowed me, that then triggered scenes where she walked along the beach by the coast where her husband had died, and was picking up stones, searching for these hot stones that she identified as the ones that contained something of him. And that was, again, a case of just going smaller and smaller and smaller. And if there's anything consistent between the writing, and they all seem to want something different, it is just zoom in, and zoom in and see what's there. And then it'll either spring back and become large, or it'll stay small. And because it's Flash, that's okay. It can stay
absolutely
small. You know, the notes in it, it just has a title. So it can go as small as that, really. So, yeah.
What have you struggled with or loved about it?
What I loved about it was, I like to talk about point of view, because when I started the novella, I was in, you know, I've written a couple flashes in third, even though it was the boys, he was the center of this third. And as I got into it, I thought, you know, I can't just keep sticking with the boy, because these other characters, they have things, and what are they going to say? And really, when it really opened up for me is when I wrote Leaving Zion and put in the girls. I've never had daughters. I've had tons of nieces. And so I just threw myself into, you know, a 7-year-old, a 6-year-old, you know, an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old, and their perspective of what, you know, the National Park of Zion would look like. And that's the first line hit me. Well, it looks all like ice cream, because I don't know if y'all have been over here and seen pictures of Zion, but it does. It looks like a layered ice cream cake, you know? And so once that voice came to me, it's probably the most stylized Flash that I've written, and it came from the point of view. If I would have just stuck with, you know, a third omniscient point of view all the way through and just kind of watched this family, I don't think I would have been as successful as with some of the other Flashes. So I had so much fun writing Leaving Zion. I had no idea where it was going. When you know, they saw the people there on the side of the road, I had no idea what was that. And then it turned into the whole idea of, you know, color and people of color and what all that means. And then I brought in all that baggage from that to kind of deal with those kind of issues, and just, you know, and cranked it up. And then the ending was just a blast, because it was became full on joy and full on acceptance and full on tolerance. And that's really what I want to get out of it. And so once I wrote that really gave me the freedom, as I worked on the other Flashes. Well, I'm going to, you know, okay, I'll just stick with the boy as he's in this, you know, ball court, you know, in these Indian ruins. And then I, you know, went with the parents. And once I got in the parents' point of view, then all the kind of the darkness came in and the tension came in, and what I was dealing with. And I couldn't have done that if I would just stuck with one character. So
that
the point
would have been a completely different story. Yeah.
And I think I'm working on a novella right now, and I think that's my biggest issue, is I'm just staying with one character, and it's just kicking me from one side of the room to the other. And I'm missing doing the point of view shifts and having the experimentation, even though I'm a realist writer, to be able to jump from different characters, like Mindy's character, and having her moment. And every person out there who's a big sister who has to watch Little Brothers know exactly what I'm talking about. So, you know, it's just, and trying to make it, the point of views, thinking it in a universal way. Everybody's been on a road trip. Everybody's been stuck in the car with each other's families and bickered and dealt with that. And everybody smells what it smells like when you have old, you know, crisp or French fries that are mashed into the floor, you know, and when it gets really hot. So, you know, those kind of things, it was the point of view of what kids would see as opposed to the parents. So that was a real eye-opener. What really got me going, the biggest challenge, well, there are two things. The same thing that Tom and Jupiter was talking about is the in-between moments. Okay, this is going to be longer. This is not going to be a flash fiction. This is going to be, you know, a continuous story. So, okay, I've got to talk about how they drive up to the rest stop, or I've got to talk about them getting out of the car. I've got to talk about them getting off and walking into the diner and that just was horrible. It was just, so if anybody out there is thinking about writing flash fictions, to allow yourself that empty space in between, because there is like Tom, I threw out some flashes that just didn't work. I wrote one flash that was about 1,000 words, where the wife finally finds out and confronts the husband about what he did. And I thought, you know, readers are so savvy, and in their imagination, they can totally see from that one jump into that jump where, you know, she already knows and ran out of money. they in their mind, I think it's like a horse, you know, like Jaws, you know, when I was young. And all the first time now, you know, you see it on TV all the time and it's not that scary. But when I saw it in a theater when I was 10 years old and he didn't show the shark at all, that was the most terrifying thing of all. And people are like jumping out of their seats and stuff. So it's almost like that argument, that fight, that moment on the side of a road, the reader could do a much better job writing it than me putting it in there. So that was really freeing to allow the reader to use the imagination, the in-between spaces of each flash, open it up. And of course, I had to get a conflict in there right away because, you know, maybe others could speak about this, but creating the thread all the way through, like in Karen's book, there's absolutely a thread because of her character is continuously taking that thread because of her personality, her experiences, how she's dealing with, you know, other girls, then with boys, and then with men, how it all moves through, that thread is definitely there. And her attitude as she moves through these different relationships. I really didn't have that with these flashes. So I had to really fall back on this one conflict that created the whole thread as I moved through. And even though some stories are more blatant, bringing up that conflict and that thread than other stories, that's what really helped me propel through this. And that's what is working on the novella I'm working with right now is that conflict. And I think that's pretty essential. I mean, we all learned way back in workshops and stuff, oh, you got to get a conflict going because, you know, if you just go out and...
I think what I liked about yours is the title is called Straight Down the Road. And so, it, you know, it's a road, you're going down it. But actually, out of everybody's, I almost felt like yours, the chapters could have been switched around quite easily, you know, and quite fluid, really, and still get the same narrative arc. So it's almost like the title's trying to trick us to say it's straight, but actually it's not.
What's so interesting about that is the last flash that's in the book, I had written and published way before I wrote many of the other flashes. So I had the luxury of knowing exactly where I was going. So like Tom talked about this earlier, is the foreshadowing was important to me as I moved through the different flashes to give a hint here and there. So when the dad tells his story about what happened to him as a kid, that was a full-on intentional foreshadowing of what happens at the end. He gave permission for the ending, you know, even though that story had been written before. So you're right, some of the flashes I did mess around with, and I think I finally settled on those last 4 because it just builds and builds and builds. And then there are the earlier stories like Powers and stuff. Those were kind of like when everybody was in bliss on the vacation before it all really, you know, everything came together. But you're right, a lot of them can be kind of mixed around. And I messed around with the order and finally did the order of the 17 that I've got and felt pretty good about it and thought it worked, you know, always keeping in the back of my mind that conflict and that thread.
That it works really well. I'm going to chat to Ellie and Karen about the same thing, but then I could talk forever, but we'll get some questions from everybody if everyone wants to start thinking about anything that they want to put in the chat box shortly. So Karen, did you have your ending in mind, like Dan had already written it, or because your ending is, your book could have gone anyway, really, and
so my opening story and end story, I knew they were already written. I couldn't get them to publish them. But they were already written, and I knew those were 2 of the stories that I thought, okay, these could actually be about the same girl, Bernadette, and I knew straight away that they were going to be first and last. So then I had to find my way through. What I loved particularly about doing this was I do write very character-driven stories, whether it's short stories or flashes. It's always character for me, always, and I loved. Because in a flash, you only get a glimpse of a character, a tiny wee part of their life. So it was nice to be able to take one character and follow them through the years and develop that character, because you don't get that chance when you're writing a flash. So it was lovely to do that. I really enjoyed that. The thing I found most difficult was avoiding repetition. Because of this idea of every story has to stand alone, how much do you have to add in to link to the previous story and the previous story and without your reader going, I already know this. Why are you telling me this again? You know, so that I kind of struggled with that a wee bit. And for the most part, I think I've avoided it. A couple of times I still read it now and go, I probably didn't need to mention that again, because, you know, it's that thing about trusting, as Dan says, trust your reader. They will remember. It's only 7,000 words long, Karen. They will remember what you said 2 minutes ago.
Yeah, but once it's out there, they just think, oh, yeah, that was on purpose. That was for emphasis. How about you, Ellie?
I think, you know, one of the things that's really enjoyable and exciting about it is how emergent the form is, and therefore how, you know, I felt, especially with Birds with Horse Hearts, kind of diving into all of these, you know, engaging so much with poetic device, but also all of the things that you expect from fiction, and that huge crossover between extended fiction and the demands of poetry. But I actually think that's what's difficult about it as well, that because it's emergent and there actually aren't that many examples of it out there, we learn how to make something good by reading other examples, right? And certainly I'm just like the hugest copier. Like any possible thing that I want to write, I will read 1,000 versions of it and figure out how everybody else did it, and then I'm like, oh, now I know what to do. And that's much more, yeah, but that's much more difficult with this because there's a handful, and so kind of picking them apart and dissecting them to figure out exactly how they work, and the mechanics of how to make them successful, it's a lot more to figure out on your own, I think, which just is time consuming. I don't know about anyone else. I just did 1,000 drafts and cut like 95% of what I'd written, I reckon.
Also, you could read everybody's and they're all so different, but it would be, you know, it's almost difficult to take what you want because
exactly
everybody's so different.
Yeah. So those kind of boundaries and guidelines and rules that I like to fall back on, we're just not there yet. Yeah.
Well, you're doing pretty well on that basis. So Jeanette, have we got the chat box open now for questions?
The chat bar should be open now. Can you see the chat bar?
If anybody
would like to ask a question of the panel,
we have
pop it in the chat bar.
Oh, we've got a few coming. Great. Okay. So Tom Walsh has asked, how much, if at all, did the stories or writing change as you worked with an editor / publisher? So I know most of you won't have worked with an editor in a traditional publishing sense where they take it and tell you to go back and do other stuff. But obviously everyone's already been published. And were there many changes between the final version and the published version for any of you? You can just leap in and answer if you want.
Zero for mine, no change at all. I was told I could if I wanted to add stories, but I was frightened. I was frightened to do that. Yeah. Just decided to leave it as it was.
Upset the balance. Yeah. I think that's another. Go on, Tom.
Just I guess with ad hoc again, I had the same sort of. Are you happy with it? That's it. But the one suggestion was it's a little short for a standalone, it was the idea was maybe you'd like to have another go and flesh it out, and that chimed with what I wanted as well. So this is for One for the River, the one that hasn't come out yet, and so I took it back because there was a window to sort of do some more writing and almost double the length of it, which was a complete shock to me. I thought I just tarted up a bit and away we go. It didn't, there was more there. I mean, I'm a chronic underwriter anyway, you know, I just sort of, that'll do off. I want a new thing. I always want the next fabulous thing that's going to be great and way better than the rubbish I'm writing now. That's the endless feeling. But this one, I was sort of forced by myself, but also by the suggestion it would be a more substantial standalone book if you could, you know, investigate the story further. And I got some feedback from a few people on the draft that had already been accepted by ad hoc. So that was a really privileged position to be in. It wasn't sort of write it and hopefully someone will like it. It was, no, they like it, but do you want to try and make it better? And I genuinely think that the addition of the extra stories does make it better. I just explored more, but that was a sort of an interesting balancing act. That's the closest I've come to editing. It wasn't, as you say, the sort of traditional editing where, you know, change line 2 and give her a hat or whatever. You know, it was much more open. Do you want to have another swing at this and see if there's any more?
The
And
nature
it
of
was
the
a good
form, isn't
experience.
it? Yeah,
it is. Yeah,
in that, you know, it's not a mainstream
and
form,
the so-called
so
industry of it is
yeah,
exactly. There's only so much. People are fantastic in what they'll do, but there's only so much, you know, they can.
Yeah, and that crosses into Stuart's question, which he's asked: how did you decide which publisher to submit to, and did you come up against multiple rejections? And I think everybody's novellas have been published as part of a competition. Am I right? In our writers here today,
that's right.
Which is a very different process from submitting them. Which I know there'll be Novella-in-Flash writers watching today or here today who will be wanting to submit direct to publishers, and then
actually, I've just realised, the Straw Gods wasn't. It was a runner-up with the Ellipsis Novella-in-Flash, but oddly enough, that gave me the confidence to submit it to 2 places. One of them was Reflex. That was before Dave started running his competition, which is now, I think, this was the year before that. And so he said, if no one's taken it, I'd like that. So I had entered it for a competition, and it had done well enough for me to think, okay, this isn't a complete weird thing. Send it to someone else, so that the competition still had a role to play. I think they are really useful for this emerging form, as Ellie puts it, because you just don't know what you're making sometimes. You know, it's not genre fiction, it's sort of literary fiction, but not really.
Yeah.
You know,
and if you can get to short list or long list, then you know it's got legs.
It's really validating.
Yeah.
Yeah,
just to get some feedback on it.
I'm sorry. When we went for it in 2018 into 2019, there were no other publishers that I could think of that I could send it to. So Bath Flash Fiction Award was really the only thing on the horizon, and that's the only place I sent it to. So
you're right. There are definitely more and more over, and that's only 2 years, isn't it? It's amazing. Ali's asked, how can you talk about how you approach structure in the terms of ordering the flashes? Does anyone want to volunteer their process?
I print them all out, and I put them on the dining table and up on the wall, and I physically move them around and see where they look right.
I did that as well. Yeah, on the double bed.
I'll take coloured pens and I'll say, well, this character's, you know, here and that character's there, and it's quite a physical process. Oh.
I only assume that you can, you know, you get to the exact right one because it just works. Yeah. You know, it could have been different, but the way you've come at it, it just works perfectly. Anybody else about their structure? Anyone like throw it in the bin and pick it out and just decide? That'll have to do.
I do remember with mine, I had mine numbered and then on a cork board just on post-it notes, and I color coded them according to how sad each one was, because what I wanted to avoid was too many negative things where you sort of get this downward spiral, and as the reader feels a little bit kind of lost or hopeless, and the result of that is that you lose a lot of the tension because you're losing the hope that that things are going to resolve themselves. So making sure that if one thing stagnated or was a little bit too heavy, that then it moved on to something else, even if that was kind of a fairly minor thing that improved the momentum and moved things forward a little bit more. So I just avoided blocking color on that board. That was a good visual tool to do that.
And yeah, it's the same with emotion.
I tried to make sure that I had a couple of funny stories that were just straightforward humour, that they were still moving the story along, but they were definitely humour based, just to lighten things a wee bit.
I love your nuns one. What's it called? The one with the nuns?
Stop and think.
Yeah, that's just a gem in the middle where it makes you stop and think and laugh. Okay, let's see if we got anybody. Okay, so Lisa has asked. We might make this the last question because I don't. We're kind of at the hour here, but we can go a little bit over. So Lisa says, so you'd all say the main difference between a novella with short chapters and a novella in Flash is that the Flash pieces have to stand alone. Can you define this standing alone? Do they all need to have a complete arc, or are they more standalone moments? That's a brilliant question. Who wants to take it?
I don't know about anyone else. I remember people asking about this a lot at the Flash Fiction Festival because people were clearly finding that really difficult. And I think most of us have taken liberties with that, with some of those stories, that they're not standalone pieces of Flash fiction, but they do stand alone in some element, right? Because most of us have pieces that actually, if you read them on their own, would be more like prose poems. I'm not convinced that it's possible to have every single piece be completely standalone. And even if I think about I think Shampoo Horns by Aaron Teal's possibly one of the best ones that's been written so far. They're not standalone pieces.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think you have a few. It would be like eating a whole box of fudge in one go, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
They're all going to be, because otherwise you're just going to be like, wow, that's amazing, and then turn the page, oh, that's amazing as well. And it's not how it works. It has to have almost an ebb and flow as well as an arc, and you're only going to get that if you have these small light filler pieces that maybe need to tell you a little bit of information. I know I definitely had that in mind. Anyone else want to offer, Dan?
To dovetail off that, how do you think the judges define standalone? Going along with what Ellie's saying, because if you're reading a work, I mean, you'd have to kind of let things go if you're going to truly think, okay, this is not a story. This did not work with a beginning, middle, and end. I wonder how the judges these days are thinking about it, because it's there in a lot of the competitions. It says they need to be standalone, 1,000 words.
Yeah.
I think maybe it comes as a whole. So as you know, so you've got your standalone, which may not all be competition winners or things, but they have a beginning and end and a role to play, maybe.
Yeah.
Because I would like to go more Ellie's way for the Novella-in-Flashes, to take away that constraint where some of these could truly be just these quick moments and to move between the chapters. I don't know if that's ever going to happen, if it's going to evolve into something like that. But I think that'd be, I mean, just in my opinion, very freeing as you're working on Novella-in-Flashes.
I mean, reading what Jenny Offill is doing with Department of Speculation and Weather and stuff, which she wouldn't define as a Novella-in-Flash, but it's really in that zone, in that she just moves from thing to little thing to little thing. She doesn't put a lot of white space or titles, but it's doing, I think, what you're saying. It's sort of, they're all standalone. But I would certainly, I think, going back to Ellie's thing, it's almost how, because even if you read actual standalone flashes, they don't all stop and start very cleanly. I mean, a lot of flashes are very open-ended that have no connection with any other. And I think some of the pieces within a Novella-in-Flash can be that, where they're that type of story that doesn't, he slammed the door, walked out, and she never saw him again. You know, it's more leaves you with a moment. I think that's what's quite hard about it, though, is that the normal drive in a novella or any book is to sort of hook someone to the next chapter. And with this one, you're trying to achieve two opposite things at once. You're trying to shut them down, stop for a minute and think, now read more. And I said, well, you know, there's a push-pull that you're trying to achieve with each of them. So some of it is to do with information and some is a feeling, but you do want them to continue reading the book. But you also, I think, want the reader to just take that moment that any flash piece will have. I mean, I think the last line is massive for the novellas in Flash, is that's what decides how closed, how story the story is, and what you want the reader to do next. Is that one where you want to sort of just, you know, drop the mic, walk away for a minute? Or is this one now you want to know what's going to happen in 3 stories or chapters time? So it is a balancing act, and it's probably one that's as subjective as anything else. But certainly I went through Straw Gods saying, what could I send out as a standalone story? And it was slim pickings, to be honest, even though I think it works really well. It was kind of maybe kind of, you know, but
I think as long as you can look and know that one isn't there for the sake of it, or you know,
It's not
That's
filler.
it, yeah,
yeah, and it's not
exactly that. Yeah.
no words are being wasted, you know, no space in that book is being taken up by something that doesn't deserve to be there, even if it's not some nugget of drama.
That's right, yeah.
Jeanette, do you want us to start winding up
I
now?
was just going to say I'm looming like the bad fairy. I think, yes, I think we'll have to wrap things up now. But that's been a fantastic discussion, and to hear everybody's stories. I know it's inspired me, and I'm sure it's inspired other people. There's lots of questions I'd like to ask, but we haven't got time, unfortunately. But you covered so much. And I think one thing I certainly took away from that was that it's often jigsawing a story together. I don't think anybody said that they started with the intention of writing a novella-in-Flash. Am I right there?
Yeah.
Jupiter.
Yes.
Yeah, they seem to grow from something else. That was absolutely fascinating. So I think just one last question I've noticed, somebody's asking about workshops and mentoring and any recommendations. Tom, I know you run a Skillshare course on the Novella-in-Flash.
Yeah, it's fairly rudimentary, but it's on there in terms of just an introduction to the Novella-in-Flash. I think I have a link on my website, but maybe I don't. There will be one too. But that's just to sort of the broad strokes is what a Novella-in-Flash is. What I knew then, I'd probably do another one and write other stuff now, but that's somewhere. I think Retreat West are looking at doing something later in the year, running a course. Nancy Stallman does a pretty impressive Novella-in-Flash course. I'm sure there's more.
Yes, and Michael Loveday.
Michael Loveday.
Yes.
And Debbie Voisey as well. Debbie Voisey's got 2 novellas coming out this year, and she does mentoring and courses and stuff.
Yeah, Michael Loveday has a newsletter he sends out, I think, on a fairly regular basis. That's full of all sorts
Michael will do one-to-one mentoring as well. So
yeah, I believe so. Yeah. He's really
so there's quite a bit out there. It's growing all the time. I'd like to just remind everybody that we are running a competition at National Flash Fiction Day, and the deadline is the 31st of October. We're looking for Novella-in-Flash between 6,000 and 12,000 words, with each individual flash no more than 1,000. So get writing. As you can see, a deadline has worked for some of our panelists. I know it's worked for me in the past. So so it would be lovely to get some entries. So thank you again to the panelists. Thank you, Johanna. It's been a fascinating evening, and good night.
But just quickly, thank you, Jeanette, for organising it all and going to all
the trouble and everything. It's a pleasure.
And it's been
a real
great.
pleasure. Thank you so much. Okay.
Cheers.
Good night.